Hey everyone, welcome to Ricktopus. Today I want to argue that evil Morty is not a villain in the way that word is usually meant, but rather the inevitable product of a system so deeply unfair, so deliberately designed to keep certain beings small, that the only person who ever truly understood it was the one it hurt the most. That the most dangerous figure in the entire multiverse was not a genius with a portal gun and decades of experience, but a young boy with a mechanical eye and the patience to wait as long as it took because he had learned from the closest possible distance exactly how the world worked and exactly who it was built for. We are going to walk through the entire story from the very beginning. From the Citadel of Ricks and the class system that held it together, through the first quiet appearance of an eye patch and a remote control in Season 1, through an election nobody saw coming, a presidency that turned an entire civilization into a machine, and finally to the moment a golden portal opened in the wall that the smartest beings in the multiverse built around themselves, and one Morty walked through it and did not look back. But before we begin, I would just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe to Ricktopus. It is completely free and it genuinely helps us keep making content for this community that we are so grateful to have built. Alright, that is enough from me. Let us get into it. The Citadel of Ricks. How Infinite Ricks built a world. To understand evil Morty, you first have to understand the world he was born into. Not the world of Rick and Morty's house on Maple Drive, and not the quiet suburban life that most Mortys live tucked away in some random corner of the multiverse. The world that matters here is bigger than any single planet or dimension. It is a world that was built on purpose by the most intelligent beings in existence, who looked at the infinite multiverse and decided the best thing they could do with all that freedom was build a society that mirrored the one they left behind. That world is the Citadel of Ricks, and everything that happens in the story of evil Morty begins and ends there. The multiverse in Rick and Morty operates on a simple but enormous idea. There are infinite dimensions, infinite versions of reality, and in an almost uncountable number of those realities, a man named Rick Sanchez exists. These Ricks all share the same genius, the same general history, the same face, and the same attitude toward the universe. They are the smartest people in every room they walk into. They have portal guns that let them travel anywhere instantly. They have seen more of existence than almost any other being alive, and for most of them, that level of intelligence comes with a kind of deep loneliness that nothing seems to fix. At some point, a group of these Ricks made a decision. Instead of living alone in their separate dimensions, bouncing from adventure to adventure with no real community, they would find each other. They would build something together. The result was the Citadel of Ricks, a massive structure floating in space that first appears in the Season 1 episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. When we see it for the first time in that episode, the Citadel is already enormous and already fully functioning. It is not a new project. It is an established civilization with its own government, its own economy, its own neighborhoods, and its own rules. Thousands of Ricks and Mortys live there, and the society runs like a machine. The way the Citadel was designed tells you a lot about the kind of people who built it. Every Rick who came to live there brought their technology, their knowledge, and their experience from their own dimension. The result is a place that is absurdly advanced by any standard. The streets, the buildings, the businesses, the way goods and services move through the Citadel, all of it is built on Rick-level science. There is no problem that cannot technically be solved because the people running the place are, by definition, the smartest versions of a genius that exists across infinite universes. On paper, this should mean the Citadel is some kind of paradise, and in some ways it does look like one at first glance. But the Citadel was not governed by all the Ricks equally. The actual power of the Citadel rested with a smaller group called the Council of Ricks. The Council was made up of a select group of Ricks who represented the broader population of Ricks living there. They made the laws, they handled disputes between dimensions, they decided the direction of the Citadel's future. In Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, we see the Council in action when they summon Rick C-137, the Rick we follow throughout the show, to answer for the murders of several Ricks across the multiverse. The Council operates with total confidence. They are used to being in charge. They speak to Rick C-137 as if he is beneath them, even though he is technically the same person they are. The authority the Council has is not something they earned in a single moment. It was built up over time, through the slow construction of a system that placed a specific group of Ricks at the top. Rick C-137 is unique among all the Ricks in one very important way. He refused to join the Citadel. While other Ricks were pledging loyalty to the Council and building their lives on the shared structure of Citadel society, Rick C-137 stayed away. He is what the Council calls a rogue Rick. He does not answer to them, does not follow their rules, and does not recognize their authority over him. This makes him dangerous in their eyes, and it makes him a suspect the moment something goes wrong. When Ricks start dying across the multiverse in that Season 1 episode, the Council does not spend much time looking elsewhere. Rick C-137 is the obvious choice. He is the one who never played by the rules. He is the one who always thought he was better than everyone else, even in a building full of people who are all, technically, himself. This dynamic between Rick C-137 and the Council is one of the first cracks you can see in the foundation of the Citadel. The Council frames their pursuit of Rick C-137 as justice. They say they are protecting their people. But there is something else underneath that. Something that looks more like control. The Citadel was built around the idea that Ricks are superior, and the Council represents the most superior among them. Anyone who refuses to acknowledge that hierarchy, even another Rick, becomes a threat. Not because they are violent or dangerous by nature, but because their independence challenges the whole structure the Citadel is built on. It is also worth looking at why the Mortys are there at all. Every Rick on the Citadel has a Morty. This is not a coincidence, and it is not simply sentimental. There is a practical reason that gets introduced in close Rick counters of the Rick kind. Rick's genius, the sheer level of his brain activity, produces a kind of signal. That signal can be tracked. It can be detected by anyone with the right equipment looking for a Rick moving through the multiverse. A Morty, however, produces a completely different kind of brain energy. Mortys are not geniuses. Their thoughts are scattered and simple in a way that creates a kind of noise, and when that noise is placed right next to Rick's signal, it cancels it out. A Rick traveling with a Morty is effectively invisible to anyone trying to track him. Mortys are, in the language of the show, a shield. This fact is one of the most quietly disturbing things the show tells us about the Citadel. Every Morty on that structure exists, at least in part, as a functional tool. The reason Ricks bring Mortys along on their adventures is not purely because they love them, even if love becomes part of it over time. The reason is that Mortys make Ricks harder to find. The Citadel, which runs on Rick intelligence and Rick power, is built in part on the utility of a group of young boys who had no say in the role they were assigned. The society functions because Ricks are at the top, and Mortys, by the logic of the whole arrangement, belong beside them, not as equals, as accessories. When you walk the streets of the Citadel, at least in the version shown to us across the first 3 seasons of the show, you see a city that reflects this imbalance at every level. Ricks run the businesses. Ricks hold the positions of authority. Ricks are the ones whose opinions shape the laws and the culture. Mortys, meanwhile, work the jobs that Ricks do not want. They fill the roles that keep the place running without receiving credit for it. There are Morty schools on the Citadel, but the education system there is not designed to produce leaders or thinkers. It is designed to produce Mortys who are ready to serve. The whole infrastructure of the Citadel treats the gap between Ricks and Mortys not as something unfair, but as something natural, as if it could not possibly be any other way. The Council of Ricks defended this structure fiercely. Any challenge to it was treated as disorder. The whole point of the Citadel, at least from the Council's perspective, was to create a stable place where Ricks could thrive. Stability meant keeping things exactly as they were. The Ricks who ran the Citadel had convinced themselves, the way people in power often do, that the current arrangement was not just convenient, but correct. That Ricks were supposed to lead and Mortys were supposed to follow, because that is simply how things work. The genius leads and the ordinary follows. This belief was not written into any law. It did not need to be. It was just the air everyone breathed on the Citadel. This is the world that was waiting when close Rick counters of the Rick kind introduces us to the Citadel. It is impressive. It is enormous. And it is rotten at its core in a way that none of the Ricks in charge seem willing to look at directly. A civilization built by the smartest people in the multiverse, which somehow still managed to build a class system, a corrupt government, and a permanent underclass made up of children. The genius of the Ricks did not prevent any of this. In a way, their genius is exactly what made it possible. Because when you are convinced that you are always the smartest person in the room, it becomes very easy to believe that any system you design must also be smart. That the rules you write must be fair simply because you wrote them, and that anyone who disagrees is just not smart enough to understand. The Citadel in Season 1 is a place in complete control of itself. The Council is confident. The power structure is solid, and nobody inside it is seriously thinking about what happens if one of the Mortys ever decides to stop playing the role that was chosen for them. But that is exactly what is coming. And the first hint of it appears at the very end of close Rick counters of the Rick kind, in the final seconds of the episode, in the form of a single Morty with a scar across his eye and a remote control in his hand, pulling the strings on a Rick, like a puppet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before we get to that moment, though, we need to understand what life was actually like for the Mortys living under all of this. Because the system that would eventually produce the most dangerous being in this multiverse did not create him by accident. It created him one small injustice at a time. Section 2. The class system. What it means to be a Morty on the Citadel. Every society has a story it tells about itself, a version of its own history that explains why things are the way they are, and why they could not possibly be any different. The Citadel of Ricks had one of these stories too, and like most of those stories, it was told by the people at the top. The story the Citadel told was simple. Ricks are geniuses. Mortys are not. Ricks built this place. Mortys benefit from being here. Everyone has a role, and the role you are born into is the role that fits you best. This was not presented as an opinion on the Citadel. It was presented as a fact, as obvious and as natural as the laws of physics. And when a story like that gets told loud enough, for long enough, by enough people in positions of power, it stops feeling like a story at all. It starts feeling like the truth. But the truth about what life actually looked like for a Morty on the Citadel was something very different. And the clearest window into that truth comes from the Season 3 episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which the show also sometimes refers to as Tales from the Citadel. This episode does something that no episode before it had done. It steps away from Rick C-137 and Morty C-137 entirely and spends its full runtime inside the Citadel, following a handful of different characters through their ordinary days. What it shows is a society that had, by that point in the show, fully developed into something with real neighborhoods, real jobs, real schools, and a real and deeply unfair gap between the people who had power and the people who did not. The first thing that stands out when you look at the Citadel through this lens is how completely the two groups had been sorted. Ricks and Mortys were not mixed together in the way that might suggest equality. They occupied different parts of the Citadel, moved through different spaces, and existed on different levels of the social ladder in ways that were visible in every part of daily life. There were Ricks who owned things. There were Mortys who worked for them. There were Ricks who taught. There were Mortys who sat in the classroom and were told what to think. There were Ricks who held authority on the streets. There were Mortys who walked those streets with their heads down. One of the most telling parts of Tales from the Citadel is the school scene. We see a classroom full of young Mortys being taught by a Rick. The lesson itself is not the point. What matters is the conversation that happens when one of the Morty students tries to talk about his dreams. He wants more. He wants a future that looks different from what the Citadel has already decided he will have. And the Rick teacher shuts that down without a second thought. He does not do it cruelly, exactly. He does it the way someone does when they genuinely believe they are being helpful. He tells the Morty, in plain language, that Mortys do not become those things, that there is a place for Mortys on the Citadel, and it is not at the top. The message underneath all of it is not even hidden. It is delivered like advice, like wisdom, like something the Morty should be grateful to hear before he wastes any more time imagining a life that was never meant for him. This is how the class system on the Citadel reproduced itself. Not primarily through force, though force was available when needed. It reproduced itself through belief. By teaching Mortys, from the time they were young, that their place was fixed, that their value was tied to how useful they could be to the Ricks around them. That ambition, for a Morty, was not an admirable quality, but a confused one. The school was not a place where Mortys were given tools to build their own futures. It was a place where they were taught to accept the future that had already been designed for them. Outside the school, the economic structure of the Citadel told the same story in a different language. Mortys worked. They filled the labor positions that kept the Citadel running at a basic level. Factory jobs, maintenance roles, the kind of work that is necessary but invisible. The kind of work that everyone depends on and almost nobody respects. Meanwhile, the ownership class on the Citadel was made up almost entirely of Ricks. Ricks ran the businesses. Ricks collected the profits. The gap between what the average Morty earned and what the average Rick had access to was not small. It was the kind of gap that, once you see it, makes it hard to believe the society was ever designed with fairness in mind. There is a moment in Tales from the Citadel that captures this gap in a very specific and memorable way. It involves a product called Simple Ricks Wafer Cookies. On the surface, this is just a snack. But the way the product is made is one of the more disturbing things the episode quietly reveals. Somewhere inside the Citadel's factory system, there is a Rick who is being kept in a kind of loop. He is a Rick who, at some point, made a choice that the other Ricks consider strange. He chose his family over his ambitions. He found a kind of simple happiness in that life. And the corporation running Simple Ricks found a way to harvest the chemical feeling of that happiness from his brain and put it into a cookie. This Rick is not free. He is not living. He is a resource being used by a business to make a product. And the Ricks who run that business do not seem to find anything wrong with this. They have turned one of their own into a machine, because the system they built values productivity and profit above almost everything else. If that is what could happen to a Rick who stepped outside the expected mold, it tells you a great deal about how much room there was for any kind of individuality on the Citadel. And for Mortys, who were already at the bottom, the margin was even smaller. The parts of the Citadel where Mortys lived in the largest numbers had a name. It was called Morty Town. The name itself is worth sitting with for a moment because it is the kind of name that a place gets when nobody in power cares enough to give it a real one. Morty Town was not the shining part of the Citadel. It was not where the nice restaurants were or where the well-funded schools sat. It was crowded, it was rough, and it was the place you ended up when the Citadel's economy had no better use for you. Some Mortys in Morty Town had turned to things that were clearly not good for them. The kind of choices that people make when legitimate paths have been closed off and the only options left are bad ones. The existence of Morty Town was not an accident. It was the natural result of building a society where one group had access to resources and opportunity, and another group was handed the leftovers. The policing of the Citadel was one of the most visible expressions of the power imbalance. In Tales from the Citadel, we follow two cops through their day. One is a Rick, one is a Morty. On paper, they are partners. In practice, the Rick partner makes every decision, dismisses the Morty partner's instincts, and treats the whole arrangement as an inconvenience. The Morty cop in this storyline is not incompetent. He is actually right about several things his partner refuses to listen to. But being right does not matter much when the structure around you has already decided that the Rick in the room is always the one who gets to lead. The Rick and Morty police partnership looks, from a distance, like it might represent some kind of equality. Up close, it is just the same hierarchy wearing a different outfit. What makes all of this especially heavy is that the Mortys on the Citadel did not choose to be there in any meaningful sense. Nobody asked them. They were brought into this system because they were useful to the Ricks who needed them. The brainwave dynamic that makes Mortys valuable as shields for Rick's signal meant that every Rick had a practical reason to have a Morty nearby. But practical reasons are not the same as respect. You can need something and still treat it as less than you. And that is largely what happened on the Citadel. The Mortys were needed, and they were there, and the system was built around using them, while giving them as little as possible in return. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from living inside a system like that. A weariness that builds slowly over years when you are told again and again that your ceiling is low and you should be grateful for the roof. Most of the Mortys on the Citadel carried that exhaustion without ever letting it become anything louder. They went to their jobs, they lived in their neighborhoods, they followed the rules of a society they never agreed to. They made the best of a life that was never designed with them in mind. Most of them. But resentment, when it has nowhere to go, does not disappear. it collects. It goes quiet, and it waits. And sometimes it finds a voice in the one person who is not willing to look at the ceiling and call it enough. The Citadel was a pressure system, and pressure systems, by their nature, always eventually find a release. The Mortys living under this system had no political power. They had no representation on the Council of Ricks. They had no formal way to challenge the rules that governed their lives. The closest thing to a future that the Citadel offered a Morty was the chance to serve a Rick well enough that the Rick might, in some private and unofficial way, treat him with a little more warmth than the system required. That was it. That was the ceiling. And for most of the Citadel's existence, that ceiling held, because nobody with any real power was paying attention to what was building up underneath it. The class system on the Citadel was not some minor background detail in the story of evil Morty. It is the foundation of everything he becomes. You cannot understand why he does what he does without understanding what the world looked like to a Morty who was paying attention. And some Mortys were paying very close attention. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before we talk about the Morty who turned that attention into action, we need to go back to the moment he first appeared on screen. Because it was quiet, it was brief, and most people watching did not fully understand what they had just seen until years later. Section 3, Eye Patch Morty, the first appearance. Season 1, Episode 10. There are moments in television that do not announce themselves. They arrive quietly, dressed up as something smaller than they are, and most people watching move right past them without realizing they have just seen something that will matter enormously later. The final seconds of close Rick counters of the Rick kind, the 10th episode of Rick and Morty's first season, is exactly one of those moments. It lasts only a few seconds. There is no dramatic music swelling behind it. Nobody in the episode stops to explain what it means. The camera simply shows you something, and then the episode ends. And if you were not paying the right kind of attention, you probably just thought it was a clever little twist and moved on with your evening. But that final image, a Morty with a scar running across one eye and a small remote control in his hand, is the beginning of one of the most carefully constructed character arcs in the entire show. Everything that comes later, every plan, every move, every shocking moment in Evil Morty's story has its roots in this episode. To understand what that ending means, you have to understand the full episode that leads up to it. Because the ending only lands the way it does because of everything the episode has already built. Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind opens with something genuinely disturbing. Across the multiverse, Ricks are being murdered. Not one Rick, not a few. Multiple versions of Rick Sanchez in different dimensions are being killed one by one. And each time one of these Ricks dies, the evidence left behind points in the same direction. It points toward Rick C137, the Rick we know, the one who lives in the Smith family house and goes on adventures with his grandson Morty. Every crime scene, every piece of evidence, every trace left behind at each murder is tied to him. The Council of Ricks, who already had a complicated relationship with Rick C137 because of his refusal to be part of their organization, moves quickly. They bring him in. The scene where Rick C137 faces the Council is one of the better early glimpses at how the Citadel operates. The Council does not approach this as an investigation where the outcome is uncertain. They have already decided. The evidence points at Rick C137, and Rick C137 is already the kind of Rick they do not trust. He is the rogue. He is the one who never joined up, never pledged loyalty, never sat down and accepted his place in the structure they built. In their minds, this is almost too clean. Of course it was him. It fits the profile they already had of him. Rick C137 protests. He tells them he did not do it. The Council is not particularly interested in hearing that. Rick C137 and Morty manage to escape from the Citadel during all of this, which is not especially surprising given who Rick is. Once they are free, Rick starts trying to figure out what is actually going on, because if someone is killing Ricks and framing him for it, he needs to know who that someone is before the Council gets to him. What follows is the kind of investigation that moves quickly in the way Rick and Morty episodes tend to, jumping through portals, following leads, and eventually arriving somewhere that neither of them expected. What they find is a hidden location, and inside that location is something that takes a moment to fully process. There are pods. Rows and rows of pods, and inside each pod, is a Morty. Not one or two Mortys, dozens of them. Young boys from different dimensions, all collected together in this hidden space, all unconscious, all being used for a specific purpose. The reason they are there connects directly back to the thing we already know about Morty brainwaves. When a Rick is traveling through the multiverse, his incredible brain activity creates a signal that can be tracked. A Morty's brain activity is different enough that it produces noise which masks that signal. One Morty is enough to make one Rick harder to find. But what happens when you take dozens of Mortys and put them all in one place, all running at the same time? The noise becomes overwhelming. The masking effect becomes so strong that whatever is at the center of it becomes essentially invisible to anyone trying to track it. Whoever built this place had understood that principle and taken it to its logical extreme. They had turned it into a weapon. Rick and Morty get the Mortys out of their pods. The Mortys are disoriented and confused and clearly have no idea where they are or how they got there. Rick is moving fast, trying to figure out who set all of this up, who has been using this location as a base of operations while committing murders across the multiverse and letting the evidence pile up against him. The Council is still out there. The real killer is still out there, and Rick needs to find them before everything collapses on him. The Council closes in. There is a confrontation. And then comes the moment that the episode has been building toward, even though you could not have known that is what was happening while you were watching it. The Rick, who has been identified as the killer, is there. Except it quickly becomes clear that something is wrong with this Rick. He is not acting like a Rick. He is moving strangely, responding strangely, and when you look closer, the explanation reveals itself in a way that is genuinely shocking the first time you see it. This Rick is not acting on his own. He is being controlled. There is a device, a small remote control, and someone is operating this Rick like a machine, directing his movements from somewhere nearby. The Rick who committed all those murders, who traveled through the multiverse killing other Ricks, who left evidence pointing at Rick C137 every single time, was not acting out of his own will. He was a puppet. Someone else pulled the strings. And then the camera finds the person holding the remote control. It is a Morty. Not a Rick, not some alien villain, not some shadowy organization with a complicated agenda. A Morty. A young boy, roughly the same age as Morty C137, standing there with a remote control in his hand, looking completely calm. He has a scar running horizontally across one of his eyes and an eye patch covering it. He does not look panicked. He does not look like someone who has just been caught. He looks like someone who ran a plan, got most of what he needed out of it, and is now deciding what the next move is. The Council deals with the controlled Rick. The immediate threat is neutralized. But then something happens that is easy to miss if you are watching quickly. The Morty with the eye patch slips into the group of rescued Mortys. All those kids who are in the pods, now freed and standing around in a confused group, all looking the same, all dressed the same, all sharing the same basic face. He simply walks into that crowd and disappears. Nobody grabs him. Nobody even seems to realize what has happened. One moment he was there, the next moment he is just another Morty in a group of Mortys, and nobody on the Council, nobody running the Citadel's security, can pick him out from the others. Before he disappears into that crowd, though, there is one more detail. He reaches up and removes the eye patch. Underneath it is not a damaged eye or a scar. It is a mechanical eye. A small piece of technology embedded where his natural eye should be. He removes the eye patch, and in doing so, removes the most recognizable thing about him, the one feature that made him stand out. And then he is gone. This is his first appearance. That is the whole scene. A few seconds, a remote control, a mechanical eye, and then nothing. No name given, no backstory explained, no villain monologue. Just a Morty who was clearly operating at a level that nobody around him knew was possible, and who walked away clean. It is worth staying with the full weight of what this scene is actually telling you. A Morty planned and executed a series of murders across the multiverse. He built or obtained a device capable of controlling a Rick remotely. He set up a hidden base and filled it with dozens of kidnapped Mortys, understanding the brainwave dynamics well enough to use them as a tool. He framed Rick C-137 precisely and deliberately, choosing him specifically, presumably because Rick C-137's status as a rogue Rick made him a believable suspect to the Council. He ran this entire operation without being detected by the Citadel's security, without being tracked by the Council, and without leaving any trail that pointed back to him rather than to Rick C-137. And then when the plan was interrupted, he had an exit strategy ready and used it so smoothly that a room full of Ricks did not notice him leaving. This is not a Morty who snapped and did something impulsive. This is a Morty who thought deeply and over a long period of time about how power works, who holds it, and how to move around it without being seen. He understood the Citadel well enough to weaponize its own logic against it. He knew that the Council would look at Rick C-137 first because of who Rick C-137 was in their system. He used their bias as a tool. He used the brainwave masking idea, which was originally something Ricks designed for their own protection, and turned it into cover for an operation aimed at Ricks. He took the system's own rules and bent them into something that served his purposes. The question that the episode leaves completely unanswered is the most important one. Why? Why did this Morty kill those Ricks? What was the goal? Was it revenge? Was it a test? Was it the first step in something much larger? The episode does not say. It just ends, with him gone and the question hanging open. At the time of broadcast, some viewers assumed this was a self-contained twist, a clever one-off detail that added some dark flavor to the episode. It was not. It was the opening move in a story that would take years to unfold. What we know from this episode, stripped down to its bare facts, is this. Somewhere in the multiverse, a Morty had decided that the life assigned to him was not the life he was going to live. He had looked at the system built by and for Ricks and decided he was not going to be a cog inside it. He had skills, he had intelligence, and he had a willingness to act in ways that no Morty was supposed to be capable of. He moved in the shadows, he planned ahead, and he was patient enough to let the plan play out without rushing it. He was caught, technically, but he walked away. And walking away clean from a room full of Ricks, while the Council of Ricks was actively hunting for a killer, is not something an ordinary Morty does. This is the version of evil Morty the show introduces to us. Not yet a leader, not yet a politician, not yet the most powerful being on the Citadel, just a boy with a plan and a mechanical eye and the ability to disappear into a crowd and leave every genius in the room standing there with no idea what just happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But to understand how this boy eventually becomes what he becomes, you first need to understand the invisible wall that surrounded every universe he could have escaped to. A wall that Rick himself unknowingly helped build, and a wall that would eventually become the final thing standing between evil Morty and total freedom. Section 4. The Central Finite Curve. Rick's ego made into a wall. Infinity is a word that gets used a lot in Rick and Morty. Infinite dimensions, infinite versions of people, infinite possibilities spread out across a multiverse so large that no mind can fully wrap itself around the scale of it. The show uses that infinity as a backdrop for most of its stories, and for a long time it feels like a feature. Like the openness of the multiverse is part of what makes Rick so free. He can go anywhere. He can do anything. There is no wall around him because there cannot be a wall around something that is infinite. Except, as the story of evil Morty eventually reveals, that is not entirely true. There is a wall. It has always been there. Most people living inside it do not know it exists, and the ones who built it had very specific reasons for not advertising that fact. That wall is called the Central Finite Curve, and it is one of the most important pieces of the entire evil Morty story. The Central Finite Curve is not introduced by name until the Season 5 finale, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack. But once it is explained, it reframes everything that came before it in a way that is genuinely hard to shake. It changes how you see the Citadel. It changes how you see Rick. And it changes how you understand what evil Morty has been working toward since the moment he first appeared on screen in Season 1. The explanation comes from evil Morty himself, which is fitting. He is the one who understands it most clearly, and he is the one who has spent the most time thinking about what it means. The way he describes it is straightforward and devastating in equal measure. The multiverse, in its true form, is infinite in every direction. Infinite universes, infinite versions of reality, infinite possibilities that have nothing to do with Rick Sanchez at all. Universes where Rick was never born, or where he was born but never became a genius, or where genius itself works completely differently than it does in the worlds we have seen. A real, honest infinity contains all of those things and more. It has no preference for any one kind of universe over another. It does not organize itself around who is smartest or strongest or most powerful. It just is, in all directions, forever. The central finite curve is what happens when someone takes that infinity and cuts a piece out of it. Specifically, the Ricks cut a piece out of it. They drew a border around a specific section of the multiverse, a section that contains every universe where Rick Sanchez is the smartest being alive. Every dimension inside the curve shares that one characteristic. In all of them, in every single one, Rick is the top of the intellectual food chain. There is no being smarter than him inside the curve. There is no civilization that has outpaced him, no alien that thinks at a level he cannot match, no version of reality where he is not, by definition, the most brilliant mind in existence. The Ricks took the infinite multiverse and carved out the part of it where they are always the best. And then they built a wall around it. Everything the Citadel is, everything the Council of Ricks ever did, every adventure Rick C-137 ever went on. All of it happened inside that wall. The Citadel does not float in true infinity. It floats in a managed, curated section of the multiverse that was specifically designed to be a place where Ricks are always on top. The society the Ricks built, the one we spent the first two sections of this essay examining, is not just a society with a class structure. It is a society that exists inside a reality that was engineered, at the most fundamental level possible, to guarantee Rick's superiority. When evil Morty explains this in Rick Murray Jack, he does it in a way that makes the meaning land as hard as possible. He points out that the wall around the central finite curve is not a defensive structure in the normal sense. It is not there to keep threats out. It is there to keep the wrong kinds of universes out. The universes where Rick is not the smartest. The universes where something or someone exists that is beyond Rick's level. Those universes are on the other side of the curve, in the true infinity that surrounds it, and they cannot get in because the Ricks specifically made sure of that. The central finite curve is, at its core, a monument to Rick's ego. It is what happens when the most intelligent man in the universe decides that the universe should be arranged around that fact. This is a heavy thing to sit with, especially if you have spent any time genuinely admiring Rick as a character. And a lot of people have, because Rick is designed to be admirable in certain ways. He is funny and capable and genuinely does care about the people closest to him, even when he works hard to pretend otherwise. But the central finite curve does not let you look away from something underneath all of that. Underneath the humor and the adventures and the occasional moments of real tenderness is a man who, at some point in his history, looked at an infinite and open multiverse and decided that his primary concern was making sure he was always the most important thing in it. Not protecting the people he loved, not building something that would last, not contributing to a universe that might be better for everyone in it. Making sure that wherever he went and whatever he did, he was the smartest one in the room. The central finite curve is the physical expression of that priority, built into the structure of reality itself. The Ricks who built it did not do so alone in the sense that it was one Rick's project. This was a collective effort, the kind of massive undertaking that required the combined knowledge and resources of many Ricks working together. The Citadel, with all its infrastructure and technology, was the organization that made something like the central finite curve possible. It required that level of cooperation, that many geniuses working toward the same goal. And the goal, when you strip away everything decorative about it, was control. Control over which versions of reality were allowed to be part of the connected multiverse. Control over the conditions under which Rick would always be the dominant force. Control, ultimately, over the story the multiverse told about who mattered most. For the Mortys inside the curve, this fact carries a specific weight. They were not just living in a society that treated them as second class, they were living in a section of the multiverse that had been deliberately shaped to make sure the people above them were always on top. The unfairness was not just social. It was written into the structure of the reality they inhabited. A Morty living on the Citadel was not just dealing with a corrupt government or an unfair economy. He was dealing with a version of the multiverse that had been edited at the deepest level to be a place where his ceiling was permanent. There was nowhere inside the central finite curve where a Morty could exist in a reality that was not, by design, built around Rick's greatness. This is what makes Evil Morty's eventual goal so significant. Because once you understand what the central finite curve is, his plan stops being about revenge or power or politics. Those things are part of it, but they are not the heart of it. The heart of it is escape. Real escape. Not just from the Citadel. Not just from the Council, not just from one bad situation or one corrupt system. Escape from the entire curated section of the multiverse that was built to make sure someone like Evil Morty, a Morty who refused to stay in his assigned place, could never truly be free. The central finite curve is the ultimate ceiling, and it is not a social construction that can be reformed from within. It is a physical wall built into the fabric of reality. You cannot vote it away, you cannot protest it away. The only way past it is to break through it. And breaking through it requires understanding something that not many beings inside the curve ever stop to think about. The curve has a mechanism. It is not just a concept or a philosophical idea. It is a real structure with real engineering behind it because the Ricks who built it were engineers above all else. Which means, in theory, it can be undone by someone with enough knowledge of how it was put together and enough resources to power the process of taking it apart. Evil Morty, who has been thinking about this longer and more carefully than anyone else, understands this. The plan he eventually executes in Season 5 is built entirely around this understanding. Every step he takes toward the presidency of the Citadel, every move he makes after winning that election, every resource he acquires, and every piece he puts in place is oriented toward one final moment. The moment the wall comes down. But that is still several steps ahead of where the story needs to go. Because before we can talk about how Evil Morty brings the curve down, we need to talk about how he got to a position where doing so was even possible. And getting to that position required him to do something that no Morty in the history of the Citadel had ever done. It required him to walk into the political arena of a society designed to keep Mortys powerless and win. There is one more thing worth noting about the central finite curve before we move forward. Rick C137, the Rick we know best, is in a complicated position relative to all of this. He is one of the Ricks who exists inside the curve, which means he is one of the Ricks who benefited from it. Whether he was directly involved in building it, or whether it predates his involvement with the Citadel, is something the show does not state with complete clarity. What is clear is that when Evil Morty explains the curve in Rick Mirai Jack, Rick C137 does not argue with him. He does not tell Evil Morty that he is wrong, or that the curve was built for good reasons. He listens. And in that silence, there is something that looks a great deal like recognition. Like a man hearing a truth about himself that he already knew and had been finding ways to not look at directly. The central finite curve is the deepest layer of the world Evil Morty was born into. It is the thing underneath everything else. The class system on the Citadel, the Council of Ricks, the way Mortys were used and dismissed and kept small, all of it sat on top of this foundation. A foundation that said clearly and permanently that the multiverse belongs to Rick. Understanding the curve is understanding the full size of what Evil Morty decided to fight against. And fighting against the full size of that thing is what turns a smart, angry boy with an eye patch into someone the entire Citadel should have been afraid of from the very beginning. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next chapter of his story takes place years after his quiet disappearance in Season 1, and it unfolds inside the Citadel itself, in the middle of an election that almost nobody saw coming, and nobody was prepared for. Section 5, Tales from the Citadel, The Election Arc, Season 3, Episode 7. By the time Season 3 of Rick and Morty arrives, a lot has changed on the Citadel. The Council of Ricks, who were running things with total confidence back in Season 1, are gone. Their removal happened in the Season 3 premiere, when Rick C-137 allowed himself to be captured and used that situation to dismantle the Council from the inside, leaving the entire power structure of the Citadel without its leadership. The government that had controlled Citadel life for so long had been torn out at the root, and what was left was a society trying to figure out what came next. There was a vacuum where authority used to be, and vacuums do not stay empty for long. Somebody was going to step into that space. The question was who? The answer comes in Season 3, Episode 7, an episode called The Ricklantis Mix-Up. It is one of the most unusual episodes the show ever produced, and it is unusual in a very specific way. Rick and Morty, the two main characters whose names are literally in the title of the show, are barely in it. The episode opens with them preparing to go to Atlantis, which sounds like it would be a significant adventure worth following. And then the show simply does not follow them there. Instead, it stays on the Citadel and spends its entire runtime watching a handful of different characters live through different parts of their ordinary day, each story running alongside the others, each one revealing a different piece of what Citadel life actually looks like from the inside. It is a portrait of a society, told from multiple angles at the same time, and every angle is dark in its own way. The first story follows two cops on their beat. One is a Rick, one is a Morty. They are supposed to be partners, which is the kind of thing the post-Council Citadel was trying to push as a sign that things were changing, that Mortys and Ricks could work together as equals. The reality of the partnership tells a different story. The Rick partner drives, the Rick partner makes every call. When the Morty partner has instincts or ideas, the Rick partner brushes them off without much thought. There is nothing hateful about how the Rick treats his Morty partner. It is more casual than that, more automatic. He simply does not register the Morty beside him as someone worth listening to. They end up in Morty Town on a call, which quickly becomes dangerous. And what happens there strips away whatever thin idea of equality the partnership was supposed to represent. The Morty cop, who was right about things the Rick cop refused to hear, ends up dead. The Rick walks away. The system continues. The second story follows a group of worker Mortys inside the Simple Rick's wafer cookie factory. These are Mortys at the bottom of the Citadel's economy, doing repetitive labor inside a corporation that profits from something genuinely disturbing. Deep inside the factory, a Rick is being kept in an isolated room in a kind of loop, his brain wired to a machine that harvests the chemical feeling of his happiness and puts it into the cookies being sold across the Citadel. The Mortys working the line do not know this at first. When they find out, it changes things. One of the Mortys decides to free the Rick being harvested. He does. And then, in one of the episode's quieter cruelties, the factory management solves the problem the only way a machine like that knows how to. They put the Morty who freed Simple Rick into the pod instead. The line keeps running. The product keeps getting made. The only thing that changed is which living being is being used to make it. The third story follows a small group of Mortys who have decided to leave the structures of Citadel life behind entirely. They walk away from the factory jobs and the schools and the neighborhoods and head out into a less developed part of the Citadel, looking for something different. This storyline moves through some genuinely strange and sad territory, but what matters most about it for the larger story is what it represents. These are Mortys who have given up on the Citadel working for them, who have stopped trying to exist within a system that was never designed with their well-being in mind. They are not revolutionaries, they are not fighters, they are just done. And being done with a system is not the same as being free from it, as their story eventually shows. But it is the fourth storyline that everything else in the episode exists to frame, and it is the one that matters most to the story of Evil Morty. There is a Morty running for president of the Citadel. This is, on its surface, a remarkable thing. The Citadel had never had a Morty in its highest position of power. The Council of Ricks was Ricks, obviously. Whatever leadership structure existed before and after the Council was built around Ricks holding authority. A Morty entering that space was not something the system had prepared for, and the Ricks around the campaign treat it with a mixture of amusement and mild contempt at first. A Morty running for president is the kind of thing that sounds like a novelty. Something that makes for an interesting news item. Something that will be entertaining up until the point where it goes nowhere. which is where everyone expects it to go. Candidate Morty, as he is referred to throughout the episode, does not look like a typical Morty. He carries himself differently, he speaks differently. He is calm in a way that feels deliberate rather than natural. The kind of calm that a person develops when they have been thinking for a very long time about exactly how they want to present themselves. He has a Rick campaign manager who is coaching him through the process, advising him on what to say and how to say it and where to stand and what the voters want to hear. On the surface, this Rick campaign manager looks like the one in control of the operation. He is the experienced one. He is the strategist. He is the Rick. Except candidate Morty is not being managed. He is performing being managed. There is a difference, and it is visible in the small moments throughout the episode when you see something flicker behind his eyes that is sharper and colder than anything a coached candidate is supposed to show. He is not following the Rick campaign manager's advice because he needs it. He is using that arrangement because it serves a purpose. Having a Rick campaign manager makes him look like a less threatening candidate. It puts a familiar face next to him. It tells the Rick voters watching that this Morty has been properly guided, properly contained, properly placed within a structure they recognize and feel comfortable with. It is a costume, and candidate Morty wears it perfectly. The campaign trail scenes in the episode show him speaking to crowds of Mortys, and this is where the real substance of what he is doing becomes visible. He talks about the forgotten Mortys, the ones working the factory lines, and the ones living in Mortytown, and the ones sitting in classrooms being told their ceiling is low. He talks about what the Citadel was supposed to be, and what it actually became. He does not speak in complicated language. He does not throw out ideas that require a deep understanding of Citadel politics to follow. He speaks plainly and directly to the experience of being a Morty on a structure that was built without them in mind. He speaks to the exhaustion and the resentment that had been building in the Morty population for as long as the Citadel had existed. And they respond to it. The Morty voters who listen to him do not hear a strategy. They hear someone who seems to understand what their life has actually been like. That feeling, the feeling of being truly seen and heard by someone standing at a podium, is one of the most powerful things in any political system. It does not require the person at the podium to mean everything they say. It only requires the people listening to believe they mean it. Candidate Morty is precise in how he creates that feeling. He never oversells. He never gets too loud or too emotional in a way that might seem calculated. He stays measured. He stays real-seeming. He gives the Morty voters exactly what they needed to hear, delivered in exactly the tone that made it land most effectively. He wins the election. The moment he wins is shown quickly in the episode, without a lot of ceremony, because the episode is less interested in the celebration than in what comes immediately after it. And what comes immediately after it is the part of the episode that turns everything that came before it cold. His Rick campaign manager comes to see him after the victory. The Rick is pleased. He helped engineer this win, and now he expects the relationship to continue the way it has been. He expects to remain close to power, to continue being the strategist behind the new president, to keep the role he has built for himself in this operation. He speaks to candidate Morty as if they are partners, as if the working relationship they had during the campaign will continue now that the campaign is over. Candidate Morty listens to him, and then the Rick campaign manager, along with everyone else in the room who might represent a threat or a complication to what comes next, is disposed of. It happens fast, and it happens completely. The people around the new president, who thought they understood what they were part of, who thought they had a relationship with him or a role in his administration, find out in those final moments that they were never partners. They were pieces. They were tools that served a specific function in a specific phase of the plan. And now that phase is over. The episode ends with the new president of the Citadel standing at the window of his new office, looking out over the society he now controls. And in those final seconds, the show makes clear what the episode has been building toward from the start. This is not a new and hopeful leader who rose from the Morty underclass to bring real change. This is the Morty from the end of Season 1. The one with the mechanical eye and the remote control, and the plan that nobody fully understood. He has been here the whole time. He ran an election the same way he ran the operation in Season 1. Patiently, precisely, from the inside out. And nobody saw it coming until it was already done. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But winning the presidency and actually using it are two different things. And what evil Morty does with the power he now holds is where the story becomes something that the Citadel, built by the smartest people in the multiverse, had absolutely no answer for. Section 6. How Evil Morty Won. Manipulation, populism, and power. Winning is not the same as deserving to win. In a fair system, with honest rules and an informed population, the two things would line up. The best candidate with the clearest vision and the strongest plan would rise to the top, and the result would reflect something real about what the people wanted. But systems are rarely fair, and the Citadel of Ricks was not a fair system by any definition of that word. It was a system built on imbalance, held together by a story that most of its population had been told so many times they had stopped questioning it. And a system like that, one that runs on stories more than on genuine fairness, is exactly the kind of system that a person who understands stories can walk straight through. Evil Morty understood stories. He understood them the way a surgeon understands anatomy, not as a participant, but as someone who had studied the structure from the outside and knew exactly where to cut. The election that made him president of the Citadel was not a sudden event. It was the visible surface of something much deeper, a plan that had been constructed carefully and patiently over a long period of time. By the point we see him running in the Ricklantis mix-up, he is already prepared. He already knows what he is going to say, and who he is going to say it to, and what effect each word is going to produce. Nothing about the campaign feels improvised, because nothing about it was improvised. He arrived at the starting line already knowing how the race would end. The performance of being a candidate was just that, a performance. And it was a performance built on a foundation of preparation that none of his opponents could see or account for. The first and most important thing Evil Morty understood about winning the election was the Morty vote. The Citadel had a large Morty population. These were beings who had lived their entire lives inside a structure that treated them as secondary, who had been told in school and at work and in every interaction with authority that their role was to follow rather than to lead. They had resentments. They had frustrations that had never been given a proper outlet. They had watched Ricks hold all the power for as long as the Citadel had existed, and most of them had accepted that reality simply because there was no visible alternative. Evil Morty looked at this population and saw something that the Ricks running the Citadel had completely failed to account for. He saw a large group of people whose energy had no direction, a group whose feelings were real and powerful and entirely unused. A resource, in other words, that the current system had left sitting there untouched. He positioned himself as the answer to everything that population had never been allowed to say out loud. His campaign speeches, shown in pieces throughout the Ricklantis mix-up, are not complicated. He does not speak in the kind of long, winding language that politicians often use to make themselves sound important while saying as little as possible. He speaks short and direct and plain. He names things. He says, clearly and without dressing it up, that the Citadel was built for Ricks, and that Mortys have been living as an afterthought inside it for too long. He says that the forgotten Mortys, the ones working the factory jobs and living in Morty Town and sitting in classrooms being assigned a ceiling before they are old enough to have tried anything, deserve better than what the system has given them. He says that a Morty in the highest office would mean something real about who the Citadel belongs to. Every one of these points is chosen carefully. He is not making promises that require detailed policy explanations. He is making emotional arguments that connect directly to the lived experience of the people listening. And connecting to lived experience is something he can do with total precision because he himself lived that experience. He was a Morty. He went through exactly what the Mortys in his audience went through. He knows the specific shape of that exhaustion, the exact texture of what it feels like to be told your place is fixed. He uses that knowledge not as something he shares openly with them, not as a personal story he tells for sympathy, but as a targeting system. It tells him where to aim, and he aims there every time. The Rick population of the Citadel is a different calculation entirely. Ricks were not going to rally behind a Morty candidate based on speeches about Morty's suffering. That appeal did not work on them, and Evil Morty knew it. What he needed from the Rick voters was not enthusiasm. What he needed was for them to not feel threatened enough to unite against him. A Rick population that saw him as a genuine danger to their position would be a problem. A Rick population that saw him as a curiosity, or a novelty, or a manageable and slightly amusing political development was not. So he ran his campaign in a way that kept the Rick response exactly in that manageable range. He did not make aggressive statements aimed at removing Rick power or dismantling Rick privilege. He talked about unity. He talked about a citadel that worked for everyone. He used language that sounded inclusive and reasonable and not particularly radical. The Rick campaign manager was a crucial part of this. Having a Rick visibly attached to his operation as a senior advisor sent a message that evil Morty never needed to state out loud. It said that he was safe, that he was the kind of Morty who worked within the established order rather than against it. That whatever changes he might represent, he was not so outside the norm that a Rick needed to vouch for him. The Rick campaign manager thought he was managing a Morty. What he was actually doing was providing cover. He was the familiar face in the frame that made the less familiar face next to him seem less alarming. He was, without knowing it, being used. Evil Morty had identified the function he needed that Rick to fill and placed him in that role with complete precision, and the Rick had no idea, because the idea of a Morty using a Rick as a tool rather than the other way around was not something the Citadel's mental model had room for. This is the core of how evil Morty operates politically. He identifies what each group needs to see and then shows them exactly that thing. He runs different versions of himself simultaneously: a champion for the Mortys, a reasonable and non-threatening figure for the Ricks, a guided and properly managed candidate for anyone who might be watching for signs of instability. None of these versions contradict each other loudly enough to create a problem. They are all technically compatible. They just each tell a slightly different story about who he is, and each story is told to the audience that most needs to hear it. The other candidates in the election are worth considering briefly because the contrast between them and evil Morty says a great deal. The Rick candidates running against him operated the way Ricks always operate on the Citadel, with confidence. With the assumption that the normal rules apply and that the outcome they expect is the outcome that will happen. They did not take the Morty candidate seriously enough to adjust their strategy around him. They campaign the way people campaign when they believe they have already won, which is to say, without the sharp attention that a genuinely uncertain race requires. Their confidence was not irrational given the history of the Citadel. No Morty had ever held real power there. The idea that this one was going to change that, against all historical precedent, was not something their model of the world made room for. And that failure of imagination is exactly what evil Morty was counting on. The vote itself happens, and he wins. The episode does not dwell on the numbers or the mechanics of how the count went. It presents the outcome as something that surprises the Citadel around him, even if it does not surprise him. He became the first Morty president of the Citadel of Ricks. On the surface, the kind of people who had been pushing for Morty representation might have read this as a real victory, something that proved the system could change from within. Something that showed the gap between Ricks and Mortys was not as permanent as it had always been presented. But the moments immediately following the win tell you everything you need to know about what the win actually was. The Rick campaign manager comes to meet him after the result is confirmed. He speaks as if the relationship they built during the campaign will continue now that the campaign is over. He has expectations. He has a sense of what his role looks like going forward. He is, in his own mind, still an important figure in this operation. He is the experienced one. He helped make this happen. He is, by his own understanding, owed something. What happens next is quick and complete and entirely without hesitation. The Rick campaign manager is removed. Everyone else in the room who might have had expectations or attachments or a sense of ongoing involvement in what comes next is also removed. It does not happen in a way that broadcasts itself. Evil Morty does not make a speech about it. He does not explain himself. He simply does what needs to be done to clear the space of anything that no longer serves the next phase of what he is building. The people in that room who thought they were partners find out that the partnership was always one-sided, that they had a role in a plan, and the plan has moved past that role now. Standing at the window of the presidential office in the final moments of the episode, looking out over the Citadel he now controls, Evil Morty is not celebrating. He does not look like someone who just achieved something. He looks like someone who just finished one part of a much longer project and is already thinking about the next part. The election was never the goal. It was a step. An important one, because without it, the next steps are not possible. But it was a step in a direction that started long before the campaign and extends far beyond the presidency. The Mortys who voted for him voted for change. They voted for representation. They voted because someone finally said the things they had been feeling and gave those feelings a direction. What they did not know, what they could not have known from where they were standing, is that their votes were the mechanism that placed the right person in the right position to do something that had nothing to do with Morty rights or Citadel reform, or any of the things the speeches were about. They were fuel, real in their own pain and their own hope, but fuel nonetheless. Evil Morty looked at a population full of genuine grievance and genuine desire for something better, and he turned all of that into the engine that carried him to the top of a structure he intended to take apart. This is not a comfortable thing to look at. It is easier to see him as purely a villain with a purely selfish agenda, and maybe that is what he is. But the people who voted for him were not wrong about the things they were angry about. The Citadel really was unfair. The system really did treat Mortys as less than. The frustration that drove them to the polls was real and justified. Evil Morty did not create that frustration. He found it and used it. The distinction matters, not because it makes what he did acceptable, but because it shows how much of his power came from the genuine failures of the system he was operating within. The Citadel created the conditions that made him possible. He just understood those conditions more clearly than anyone else did. He is president now. The Citadel is his. And the Ricks who built this place, the ones who designed every system and wrote every rule and built a wall around an entire section of the multiverse to make sure they were always on top, are about to find out what it looks like when the thing they built is turned fully against them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But before we see what he does with that power, we need to understand the full force of how he used it once the doors of that office closed and the performance of the campaign was finally allowed to drop. Section 7. President Morty's Purge, Consolidating the Citadel. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a sudden shift in power. It is not a peaceful silence. It is the silence of a system holding its breath, waiting to find out what the new rules are going to be. The people who benefited from the old order are quiet because they are calculating. The people who suffered under the old order are quiet because they have learned, through long experience, that celebrating too early is dangerous. Everyone is watching. Everyone is waiting to see what the new person at the top actually does, now that the speeches are over and the votes are counted and the real work of holding power begins. The Citadel of Ricks entered that silence the moment Evil Morty won the election. And what broke that silence was not a policy announcement or a press conference or a carefully worded statement about the direction of the new administration. What broke it was the immediate and complete removal of everyone in the room who thought they still had a role to play. We already covered the moment in the previous section, but it is worth returning to it here because it is not just an ending to the election story. It is the opening statement of his presidency. The Rick campaign manager and the others present in that room after the win were not random people. They were people with proximity to power. People who had, through their involvement in the campaign, built up a sense of closeness to the new president. People who believed they were connected to him in a way that would continue now that he had won. Removing them immediately, before a single day of the presidency had passed, before any of the normal rituals of a political transition had taken place, was a message. Not a message delivered in words, because Evil Morty rarely wastes words on things that actions can say more clearly. It was a message delivered in the simple and total fact of what happened to those people. The message was this. There are no partners here. There are no allies in the way that word is normally understood. There are tools that serve a function, and when the function is complete, the tools are put away. Every person who had any expectation of ongoing involvement in his administration based on what they contributed to his campaign needed to understand that reality as quickly as possible, and the fastest way to make sure they understood it was to demonstrate it on the people closest to him first. Closeness was not protection. History together was not protection. Having helped him get where he was going was not protection. The only thing that provided any kind of continuity in his world was continued usefulness, and the moment usefulness ended, so did everything else. This principle, established in the first moments after his victory, shaped every interaction and every decision that followed. The Citadel that evil Morty inherited as president was not a stable institution waiting for steady leadership. It was a society that had already been significantly disrupted. The Council of Ricks, which had been the central governing authority for as long as the Citadel had existed in its modern form, had been dismantled during the events of the Season 3 premiere. Rick C-137 had walked into the Federation's prison system, torn it apart from the inside, and in doing so, removed the Council from power completely. The Citadel was already in a weakened and uncertain state before evil Morty ever entered the presidential race. The power vacuum that created the conditions for his rise was itself the result of Rick C-137's actions. There is something deeply fitting about that. The Rick who would eventually have to face evil Morty in the Season 5 finale was also, indirectly, the one who cleared the path that allowed evil Morty to climb. Into that already unstable environment, evil Morty brought something the Citadel had never experienced before. Not reform, not representation, not the positive change that the Morty voters who put him in office had been hoping for. What he brought was a new and more complete form of control. The Citadel, under the Council of Ricks, had been authoritarian in the casual, confident way that systems are authoritarian when they have never been seriously challenged. The authority was real, but it was also somewhat relaxed, the way power tends to be when it has been unchallenged for long enough that the people holding it have stopped thinking about it carefully. Evil Morty replaced that relaxed authority with something much tighter. Something that had clearly been thought through in detail and was applied with the kind of precision that comes from preparation rather than improvisation. The Ricks who had held various positions of authority on the Citadel, the ones who ran the institutions and managed the systems and filled the roles that kept the structure functioning, found themselves in a new and unfamiliar position. The assumption that Ricks were naturally in charge, which had been the unspoken operating principle of the Citadel since its founding, was no longer something they could count on. A Morty was in the highest office, and that Morty was not interested in governing through the existing power structure. He was interested in replacing it. The Ricks who were willing to function within his new order, who could serve a useful role in what he was building, had a place in it. The ones who represented resistance or who held positions that gave them the kind of independent authority that might eventually push back against his agenda did not have a place in it. And unlike the old council, which removed threats through political maneuvering and bureaucratic processes, evil Morty solved that problem more directly. By the time we see the Citadel again in the Season 5 finale, Rick Murray Jack, the transformation is complete and it is severe. The Citadel that exists under his presidency is not the Citadel that ran the election. The physical structure is the same. The population is still there, but the nature of what is happening inside it has changed entirely. What Rick Murray Jack reveals, when Rick C-137 and Morty C-137 arrive at the Citadel in that episode, is a facility that has been converted around a central purpose. That purpose is the construction of a device that requires an enormous and terrible kind of fuel. And understanding that fuel means understanding the darkest thing evil Morty ever did with the power he accumulated. The device he was building needed to break through the central finite curve. As we covered in Section 4, the curve is a physical structure built into the fabric of the multiverse, a wall that separates the curated section of reality where Rick is always the smartest being alive from the true infinity beyond it. Breaking through something like that requires an equally enormous source of energy. And the energy evil Morty chose to use came from suffering. Specifically, it came from the concentrated pain and anguish of Morty's. The brainwave dynamic that made Morty's useful as shields for Rick's, the fact that Morty brain activity produces a specific and powerful kind of signal, also meant that Morty's suffering produced something that could be harvested. Evil Morty had understood this. He had understood it for a long time. And as president, with the full resources of the Citadel at his disposal, he built the infrastructure to do it at scale. What Rick Murray Jack shows us inside the Citadel under his presidency is rows upon rows of Mortys in pods. Not the handful that appeared in the hidden base from Season 1. Enormous numbers. Mortys from across the multiverse, brought to the Citadel and placed in these pods and kept in states of pain and misery, their suffering being collected and converted into the energy the device needed to function. The scale of it is staggering. This is not a small or hasty operation. It is something that was built systematically, over time, using the full organizational capacity of a society that housed some of the most advanced technology in the multiverse. The president of the Citadel had turned the Citadel itself into a machine for harvesting Morty pain, and he had done it thoroughly enough that by the time anyone from outside saw it, it was already nearly complete. The Ricks on the Citadel under his presidency were not safe either. The show makes clear in Rick Morai Jack that Ricks were also being processed, also being used in ways that strip them of their autonomy and their value as individuals, and reduce them to components in a larger operation. The Citadel, that had been built to be a refuge for Ricks, a place where Ricks could exist among others who understood them and where their genius was celebrated and protected, had become a place where Ricks were as subject to evil Morty's will as everything else. The reversal is complete. The beings who built the Citadel to serve their interests were now inside a Citadel that served only one interest, and it was not theirs. There is a painful irony in this that the show does not underline because it does not need to. The Mortys who voted for evil Morty, who saw him as the first real chance at a Citadel that treated them as something more than tools, ended up in pods. Their suffering became the fuel for his plan. The liberation they thought they were voting for turned out to be a different kind of use. They went from being tools in a Rick-run system to being tools in a Morty-run system, and the difference in who was running it did not improve anything about their situation. If anything, the specific cruelty of their position under his presidency is sharper than what they experienced before. Because before, at least, their suffering was the accidental byproduct of a system that did not care about them. Under evil Morty, their suffering was intentional. It was the point. What does this say about evil Morty as a figure? It is a question worth sitting with. He emerged from the same conditions that produced the Morty voters who supported him. He experienced the same system they experienced. He felt, presumably, some version of the same things they felt. And yet he was willing to put them in pods and harvest their pain to power his escape. The Mortys of the Citadel were not, in the end, something he was fighting for. They were, in the end, another resource in a world that had always treated him as a resource. He learned that lesson very well, perhaps too well. The consolidation of the Citadel under his presidency is the phase of his story that is hardest to look at cleanly. The election arc has a kind of dark brilliance to it. The political maneuvering, the precision of his campaign, the quiet efficiency with which he removed his competitors and his collaborators alike, all of it has the quality of something genuinely impressive, even when you know it is in service of something cold. But the pods, the harvesting, the scale of suffering that he built the infrastructure for and ran deliberately across what appears to be a significant stretch of time, that is harder to admire in any way. It is the part of the story where the line between complex character and straightforward villain gets thinner. And yet, even here, the show does not let the picture be entirely simple, because the thing all of that suffering was being used to build was a door. A door out of a prison that most of the people inside it did not even know they were living in. The central finite curve, the wall around the only part of the multiverse where Rick is always on top, was built without the consent of anyone living inside it. The Mortys in those pods did not choose to live inside the curve. They were born into it. Evil Morty chose a method that was brutal and inexcusable to pursue an outcome that was, at its core, about freedom. That does not make the method acceptable. But it makes the story of what he did more complicated than a simple tale of a villain accumulating power for its own sake. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Citadel was his. The device was nearly ready, and the story of how it all came together in one final confrontation begins with a question that the show had been quietly asking since Season 1. A question about who Rick C-137 really is, and what his connection to this particular Morty actually was before any of this began. Section 8. The original Morty. Was evil Morty Rick C-137's first companion? Every story has a layer underneath it, a version of events that happened before the cameras turned on, before the characters we follow were introduced, before the world of the show was established in its current form. Rick and Morty is a show that knows this, and uses it deliberately. It plants seeds in early seasons that do not become visible until much later. And when those seeds finally grow into something, they reframe what came before in ways that make you want to go back and watch everything again with new eyes. The question of whether Evil Morty was once Rick C-137's original Morty, the first Morty this particular Rick ever traveled with, is one of those seeds. It is planted quietly. It grows slowly. And when the answer becomes visible in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, it changes the shape of the entire story in a way that nothing else in the show quite does. To understand this question fully, you have to understand something about Rick C-137's past that the show takes a long time to reveal. For most of the series, Rick's history is deliberately kept vague. We know he is a genius. We know he left his family at some point when Beth was young and came back when she was an adult. We know he has a complicated and painful relationship with his past that he covers over with humor and alcohol and constant forward motion. We know something happened to him. But the show is careful about what exactly it tells us and when, and the full picture of Rick C-137's history does not come together until late in the series. What Rick Mirai Jack gives us, through a series of flashback sequences, is the closest thing the show has offered to a complete account of who Rick C-137 was before we met him. And what those flashbacks show is a man defined by grief, and by the long, consuming mission that grief sent him on. The backstory, which had been built toward across multiple seasons, centers on the death of Rick C-137's wife, Diane. She was killed by another Rick, a Rick from a different dimension who arrived at their home when Beth was still a young child and placed a bomb that destroyed everything. The reason this was done, the identity of the Rick who did it, and the full story around that event is something the show continues to develop beyond Season 5. But the immediate consequence of Diane's death is what matters here. Rick C-137, faced with the complete destruction of the life he had built, made a decision. He chose revenge. He chose to spend however long it took, traveling through the multiverse, hunting for the Rick who killed his family. That search took years, many years. And during those years, Rick C-137 was not alone. The flashback sequences in Rick Mirai Jack show him during this period of his life, moving through different dimensions, following leads, getting closer, and then losing the trail and starting again. And in some of these moments, there is a young Morty with him, a Morty who is traveling alongside him through the dangerous and chaotic period of Rick's life when he was at his most single-minded and his most uncompromising. A Morty who experienced firsthand what it looked like to be the companion of a Rick who had decided that nothing in the universe mattered as much as the one thing he was chasing. This is where the question becomes important. The show does not have a character turn to the camera and say directly that this Morty, the one in the flashbacks, grew up to become Evil Morty. It does not offer that confirmation in plain spoken language the way a simpler show might. What it does instead is something more characteristic of how Rick and Morty handles its most significant revelations. It builds the implication carefully and thoroughly through the accumulation of details that, taken together, point overwhelmingly in one direction. The context matters enormously here. Rick C-137 is currently living with a Morty who is not his first Morty. The Morty we follow throughout the show, the one in the Smith family, is the Morty of a different Rick. Rick C-137 moved into the dimension we know as the main show universe after that dimension's original Rick and Morty both died. He essentially took over someone else's family. The Morty he has been adventuring with across the entire run of the show is not the Morty he started with, which means there was a first Morty, a Morty before this one. A Morty who traveled with Rick C-137 during a period of his life that was significantly darker and more unstable than the relatively domestic arrangement we see in the show. What happened to that first Morty is the question that Rick Mirai Jack raises without fully answering in those explicit terms. But the narrative of the episode, and specifically the way Evil Morty speaks during the climax of the episode, fills in the shape of the answer, even if it does not spell every letter out loud. During the confrontation in the Season 5 finale, Evil Morty makes references to his history with Rick that go beyond the general experience of being a Morty on the Citadel. He speaks about the dynamic between Rick and Morty, about what it actually means to be the Morty in that relationship, in a way that carries the weight of specific personal experience rather than general observation. The things he says about Rick are not the things you say about a category of person you have studied from a distance. They are the things you say about someone you were close to. Someone whose specific patterns and habits and failures you know from the inside. Someone who hurt you, not as an abstraction, but as a particular person doing particular things in a particular relationship. The flashback sequences reinforce this. We see a young Morty during Rick's years of searching, experiencing what it is like to travel with a Rick who is consumed entirely by a mission that has nothing to do with the Morty beside him. To be present, but not seen. To be along for something enormous and difficult and dangerous that you did not choose, serving the practical function of a Morty companion, which is to say, serving as cover for Rick's signal, while the Rick you are traveling with focuses entirely on his own agenda. To be useful in the narrow functional sense while being invisible in every other sense. This experience, if it is indeed what the young Morty in those flashbacks went through, maps directly onto the psychology of evil Morty in a way that feels too precise to be accidental. We have already talked in the sections on the Citadel's class system about the way Mortys were used as tools throughout the Citadel's structure. What the flashbacks suggest is that evil Morty did not just observe that dynamic from within the Citadel society. He experienced it in the most personal and direct way possible. He was the Morty of the Rick, who would become the most discussed and celebrated Rick in the multiverse, Rick C-137, and he spent those years being dragged through a mission that was entirely about Rick's pain and Rick's need for revenge, with his own feelings and his own experience treated as irrelevant to the proceedings. If you wanted to design a situation that would produce the specific kind of person evil Morty became, you would be hard-pressed to do better than this. Take a Morty who is already smart enough to be paying close attention to everything around him. Put him in a close relationship with a Rick who is brilliant and capable, and also, during this particular period, entirely self-involved in his grief and his mission. Let that Morty watch, from the closest possible distance, how that Rick operates. Let him see how Rick thinks about the beings around him, what he values and what he does not value, where his attention goes and where it never goes. Give that Morty years of this. Years of being present, but peripheral. Years of being the Morty in a Rick and Morty pairing, where the Morty's role is functional and the Rick's role is everything else. And then at some point, have the Rick abandon the Morty. Move on. Find a new dimension, a new family, a new Morty. Leave the original Morty behind in whatever state the years of that experience produced. The show's implication, built carefully across the flashback sequences and the confrontation dialogue of Rick, Mirai, Jack, is that this is what happened. Rick C-137 had a Morty before the Morty we know. He traveled with that Morty during one of the hardest and most singular periods of his life. And eventually, he moved on, and the Morty was left behind. What that Morty did with everything he had learned during those years, with the specific and intimate understanding of how Ricks operate and what they are willing to do and what they are incapable of caring about, became the story of Evil Morty. The reason this matters to the overall arc is significant. Evil Morty is not just a Morty who got angry at the Citadel's class structure. He is not just a political actor who saw an unfair system and decided to tear it down. If the show's implication is correct, he is a Morty who was personally used by the specific Rick who would later become the most famous and celebrated Rick in the multiverse, and then personally discarded by that Rick when the Rick no longer needed him. His resentment is not abstract. It is aimed. It has a face. And that face belongs to Rick C-137, even if the larger target of his actions is the entire system that Rick represents, and that the central finite curve was built to protect. This is also what makes the final confrontation between them and Rick, Mirai, Jack hit with the weight that it does. When Evil Morty speaks to Rick C-137 in that episode, there is something personal in it that goes beyond ideology. He is not talking to a symbol. He is, or at least the show strongly implies he is, talking to the specific Rick who first showed him what the Rick and Morty relationship actually is, when all the warmth and adventure and chosen family framing is stripped away from it. He is talking to the person whose behavior toward him became the blueprint for everything he built his life's plan around escaping. Rick C-137, for his part, does not argue with what Evil Morty says during that confrontation. He does not tell Evil Morty he has the wrong Rick, or that his understanding of events is mistaken. There is something in how he responds that suggests recognition. Not necessarily guilt in the form of a full confession, because Rick C-137 is not built for that kind of directness about his own failures, but something quieter than that. Something that looks like a person hearing a version of their own story that they already knew was true. The question of whether Evil Morty was Rick C-137's original Morty cannot be answered with 100% certainty based purely on what the show states in explicit terms. What can be said is that the show builds the case for it in ways that are consistent, cumulative, and structurally important to the story's meaning. The evidence is in the flashbacks, in the dialogue of the finale, in the specific personal weight of Evil Morty's words during the confrontation, and in the way Rick C-137 receives those words. The show chose not to make this a simple fact stated plainly, and that choice is itself meaningful. It asked the audience to sit with the ambiguity, to weigh the evidence, and to arrive at their own sense of what happened. But what is not ambiguous at all is what that early experience, whatever its precise details, did to the Morty who lived through it. The person who emerged from those years was someone who understood Rick better than Rick understood himself, who had been shaped by that relationship into something Rick never intended to create, and who had decided, at some point during or after those years, that he was never going to be used again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. How exactly a Morty becomes that person, what the internal process looks like when a regular boy with regular Morty feelings starts transforming into something the entire multiverse should have been afraid of, is the part of the story we have not yet fully examined. Section 9. The making of Evil Morty. Trauma, resentment, and awakening. Nobody is born the way Evil Morty is born. That is not how people work. And it is not how characters work in stories that are told carefully. You do not arrive in the world already cold, already calculating, already capable of building a multiverse-spanning plan and executing it across years without flinching. You become those things. You become them through a process, and the process always involves something being done to you before you start doing things to the world. The making of Evil Morty is not something the show lays out in a single episode or a single conversation. It is something you piece together from the edges of what is shown, from the implications of what characters say and do not say, from the gap between who a Morty is supposed to be and who this particular Morty clearly became somewhere along the way. When you put those pieces together carefully and honestly, staying close to what the show actually gives you, the picture that forms is one of the most coherent and painful character studies the series contains. Start with the baseline. What is a Morty in the world of this show before anything specific happens to him? A Morty is a young boy. He is not a genius. He does not have the kind of brain that cuts through every problem like a laser the way Rick's does. He is emotional, where Rick is analytical. He is uncertain, where Rick is confident. He makes mistakes. He has fears. He cares about people and about the outcomes of things in a way that Rick spends enormous energy pretending not to. This is not presented as a failure of Morty's character. It is just who he is. And in the world of the Citadel, in the world of the Rick and Morty relationship as it exists across most of its forms, these qualities are treated as the reason Mortys belong in a supporting role. You are emotional and uncertain and caring, therefore you follow. The Rick is none of those things, therefore he leads. This logic is embedded in the culture of the Citadel so deeply that it is not even argued for anymore. It just is. Now take that baseline Morty and place him inside the specific circumstances that the show implies for Evil Morty's early life. We discussed in the previous section the strong implication built across the flashbacks in Rick Mirai Jack that Evil Morty was once Rick C-137's original companion, that he traveled with Rick during the years when Rick was consumed by the hunt for the Rick who killed his family, that he experienced firsthand, from the closest possible distance, what it looks like to be the Morty in a relationship where the Rick is entirely focused on something that has nothing to do with the Morty beside him. Think about what those years would actually look like from the inside. You are young. You are not a genius. You are traveling through dangerous and unpredictable situations across the multiverse, not because you chose to, but because you are there and Rick needs you there. Functionally, because your brainwaves make him harder to track. You are not a partner in any real sense. You are not consulted about where you go or what you do when you get there. You are along for a mission that belongs entirely to Rick, driven by Rick's pain, aimed at Rick's goal, and measured by Rick's standards of success and failure. Whatever you feel during any of this, whatever fear you experience or confusion you feel or loneliness that builds up over the months and years of being in motion without any fixed home or any relationship that treats your inner life as something worth paying attention to, none of that enters the equation. The equation only has one variable that matters, and that variable is Rick. This is not a situation unique to this one Morty's experience, exactly. The show makes clear across its run that the Rick and Morty dynamic, even at its warmest and most genuine, has a structural imbalance built into it. Rick C137 and the Morty we follow in the main show clearly love each other in a real way. That love is not nothing. It changes things. It means something. But even within that genuine affection, there are moments scattered throughout the series where the show allows you to see that Rick treats Morty in ways that would be concerning in any relationship between two people. He dismisses Morty's feelings when they are inconvenient. He puts Morty in danger without full explanation and expects Morty to trust him. He uses Morty's brainwaves as cover for his own safety, without ever fully examining what it means to use a person's biology as a shield. The warmth in the relationship is real, but the imbalance is also real, and the show is honest about both things. Now take that same dynamic and remove the warmth. Or more precisely, imagine a version of that relationship where the Rick involved is not Rick C137 in his most domestically softened form, the Rick living in a house with a family, going on adventures that are usually at least partly for Morty's benefit, capable of genuine expressions of love, even if he fights them constantly. Imagine instead a Rick in the middle of a years-long, grief-driven hunt across the multiverse. A Rick for whom everything outside his mission has receded into background noise. A Rick for whom the Morty beside him serves one primary function and is otherwise not a significant part of his mental landscape. This is what the flashback sequences in Rick, Mirai, Jack point toward. And this is the experience that, if the show's implication is correct, the young Morty who would become evil Morty lived through. Not a relationship with warmth that was also sometimes imbalanced. A relationship that was almost entirely the imbalance, stripped of most of the warmth, across a period of years that would have been formative for any young person living through them. What does that do to someone who is already paying close attention? Because this is the other piece that matters. Evil Morty was clearly paying close attention from a very early point. The operation we see him running in Season 1, the one involving the controlled Rick and the pods of Mortys and the framing of Rick C137, required a level of understanding of Citadel systems, Rick psychology, and multiverse mechanics that is not something you develop without a long period of careful observation. He understood how Ricks think. He understood what the Council of Ricks would believe and what they would dismiss and how their biases would lead them to specific conclusions. He understood the brainwave dynamic deeply enough to weaponize it. He understood surveillance and tracking and counter-surveillance well enough to run an operation that evaded the Citadel's systems entirely. None of this is the product of a few weeks of thinking. It is the product of years of watching and learning and building an internal model of how everything around him worked. The years traveling with Rick would have been, among other things, an education. Not the kind of education that Rick intended to provide. Rick was not trying to teach this Morty how to think the way Rick thinks. He was not sitting down and walking through his reasoning so the Morty beside him could follow along. But a young person with sharp enough attention does not need to be taught directly. They watch. They absorb. They see how decisions get made and how problems get solved, and how a mind like Rick's moves through obstacles that would stop anyone else. They see what Rick values and what he disregards. They see the specific patterns in how he operates. And a Morty who was observing all of this from close range, while also processing the experience of being personally undervalued within the very relationship that was providing this education, would be developing something very particular. He would be developing a complete and unsentimental understanding of the Rick and Morty dynamic. Not the version of it that gets told in warm terms, the genius and his sidekick, the brilliant scientist and the everyday kid who grounds him, the duo who complete each other in some meaningful way. The actual version. The functional version. The version where Morty's role is defined by his utility to Rick, and where that utility, the brainwave camouflage, the emotional availability, the willingness to follow, does not translate into anything that looks like genuine equality. He would see this not as an abstract fact about the world, but as something he lived inside every day. Something with his specific face, and Rick's specific face, and the specific absence of being seen that was his daily experience. And at some point, the thing that had been building through all of those years of observation and experience would have arrived at a conclusion. A conclusion that, once reached, cannot be unreached. The conclusion that the system, the whole thing, not just his relationship with this particular Rick, but the entire structure of reality that produced that relationship and replicated it across infinite dimensions, was built to keep him and every Morty like him in a specific and permanent position. That there was no version of playing along that ended differently. That reform was not possible because the problem was not in the details of how the system was run, but in the foundations it was built on. That the only way out was not through the system, but past it entirely. This is the awakening that the section title refers to. Not a sudden moment of rage, not a breakdown or an explosion of emotion that sent him running in a new direction without thinking. Something quieter and more total than that. The moment when a person who has been watching and learning and processing finally puts everything together into a picture that is so clear and complete that it cannot be argued with. The moment the understanding becomes a decision. He was not going to be a Morty in the way that the word Morty had always meant. He was not going to fill the role the universe had designed for him. He was going to do something about it. And doing something about it required first understanding exactly what he was dealing with, which he already did, and then building, carefully and patiently, the means to act on that understanding. What he built, as we have already seen in the earlier sections of this essay, was not impulsive or reactive. The operation in Season 1 is the work of someone who has already moved past anger into something much colder and more functional. He was not lashing out. He was testing. He was learning what he could do, what systems he could move through, what resources he could build or acquire, and what the response would be when he pushed on specific pressure points. The Season 1 operation was, in a certain sense, an experiment, an early proof that his understanding of the system was accurate, and that his ability to act within it without being caught was real. He got part of what he needed out of it. He walked away. He did not panic when it went partially wrong. He adapted and disappeared. The mechanical eye is worth returning to here as a specific detail. He had replaced his natural eye with a piece of technology at some point before the Season 1 episode. This is not a small thing. It is not something you do casually or accidentally. It required technical knowledge, access to specific materials, and a willingness to modify his own body in a way that had a functional purpose. The eye patch concealed it, which means he understood the value of not revealing capabilities until the moment when revealing them served a specific purpose. He was already, by the time we first see him, a person who thought carefully about what he showed and what he concealed. A person who had been preparing for something for long enough that his preparation extended to what he carried inside his own body. The trauma that produced all of this is not something the show needs to describe in detail for the conclusion to land. The shape of it is visible in the outcomes. A person who trusts no one, who uses everyone around them as a tool, who is willing to cause enormous suffering in service of a goal, and who pursues that goal with the kind of patience and consistency that most people cannot sustain across years, is a person who learned very early that the alternative to being the one doing the using is being the one being used. That lesson, learned deeply enough and early enough, changes the structure of how a person moves through the world. It does not make them pitiable in a simple way. It does not excuse the choices they go on to make, but it explains the architecture of who they became. Evil Morty did not arrive at the Citadel's presidential election as a random act of ambition. He arrived there as the end result of a long internal process that started with experience, moved through understanding, and landed on a plan. A plan that required resources on a scale that only the Citadel could provide. And the most important resource that plan required was something devastating in its specificity. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It required the pain of others. And understanding exactly how he intended to use that pain and why that specific kind of fuel was the only thing that could power what he was building is the piece of the story that connects everything that came before it to the final act. Section 10, the plan. Building a key from suffering. Every plan has a logic to it, even the ones that look monstrous from the outside, even the ones that involve choices no decent person would make. Follow a line of reasoning that connects the goal to the method in a way that makes internal sense to the person executing it. Understanding a plan does not mean agreeing with it. It does not mean excusing what it costs or looking away from the damage it does. But if you want to understand Evil Morty fully, not just as a figure in a story, but as a character with a complete internal life, you have to follow the logic of what he built and why he built it the way he did. Because the plan that he spent years constructing and that he used the presidency of the Citadel to finally execute is not random. It is not chaotic. It is the most coherent thing in the entire story, and every piece of it connects to every other piece with a precision that reflects exactly the kind of mind that years of watching and learning and deciding produced. The goal, as we established when we talked about the central finite curve, was to get out. Not to reform the Citadel, not to make life better for Mortys within the existing structure of the multiverse, not to take power and hold it for its own sake. The presidency was never the destination. It was the vehicle. The destination was always beyond the wall that the Ricks built around the section of the multiverse they curated for themselves. The destination was the true infinity that existed on the other side of the central finite curve, the endless expanse of universes that had no preference for Rick's intelligence, no built-in guarantee of his superiority, no architecture designed to make sure he was always on top. Getting there required breaking through the curve. And breaking through the curve required something that could only be assembled with the full resources of the most powerful organization inside it. The Citadel of Ricks, with all its technology and all its infrastructure and all the accumulated knowledge of thousands of the smartest beings in the multiverse, was the only entity inside the central finite curve that had any realistic chance of building something capable of breaching it. This is why the presidency mattered. Not because being president was the point, because being president gave him control over the Citadel's resources. It gave him the ability to direct its technology, its workforce, its systems, and its organizational capacity toward the construction of his device. Without that control, the plan does not exist in any form that could actually succeed. The plan required the Citadel. The Citadel required the presidency. The presidency required the election. The election required the campaign. Each step was a door that the previous step opened, and he had mapped the whole sequence out before most of those steps were even visible to anyone watching from the outside. The device itself, the thing he was building inside the Citadel during his presidency, gets its clearest showing in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack. When Rick C-137 and Morty C-137 arrive at the Citadel in that episode, what they find is a facility that has been fundamentally converted around the construction and operation of this device. The physical scale of it is enormous. It is not a small machine in a back room. It is something that has been integrated into the Citadel's infrastructure at a deep level, something that required significant time and resources to build to the state it is in when we see it. This is not a project that was begun after the election. The election came after years of preparation. The construction of the device, or at least the planning and preparation for it, was already underway before he ever stepped onto a campaign stage. The fuel source is the part that requires the most careful examination, because it is the part that says the most about the full scope of what Evil Morty was willing to do and what he understood about the mechanics of the world he was trying to escape. The central finite curve, as a physical structure built into the fabric of the multiverse, required an equally physical force to break through. you cannot think your way past it. You cannot use a portal gun, because portal guns operate within the curve by design. The normal tools available to even the most advanced Rick inside the curve were built inside the curve, which means they are, by definition, tools for navigating within the system, rather than tools for escaping it. Breaking through required something that operated at the level of the curve itself, something with enough raw power to push past the boundary that the Ricks had constructed. And generating that kind of power required a fuel source of a scale and a nature that ordinary energy could not provide. What Evil Morty identified as the fuel source connects back to something we have already discussed at length: the brainwave dynamic. The fact that Morty brain activity produces a specific and powerful signal, a signal strong enough to mask Rick's presence when a single Morty is nearby, a signal strong enough to create overwhelming noise when dozens of Mortys are placed together. This signal is not just a convenient navigational tool. It is evidence of something more fundamental about what Morty brain activity actually produces at a physical level. The energy that comes from a Morty's mind is real and measurable and powerful enough to do things that other energy sources cannot do. Evil Morty, who had studied the mechanics of this dynamic more thoroughly than anyone else on the Citadel, because he had personal reasons to understand exactly what his own biology meant in terms of how the world used him, figured out something that the Ricks who designed the Citadel had never explored because they had never needed to. He figured out that Morty's suffering, specifically the deep and concentrated pain of a Morty in genuine distress, produced a version of that brain energy at an intensity that could not be generated any other way. This is a devastating thing to sit with. The thing that makes Mortys valuable as shields for Ricks, the brain activity that the entire Citadel's logic around Mortys was built on, turns out to also be the thing that can power a device capable of tearing through the most fundamental structure the Ricks ever built. The Ricks used Morty brainwaves as camouflage. Evil Morty used Morty's suffering as a key. Both are using the same biology, the same fundamental fact about what Mortys produce, but the direction of use is entirely opposite. The Ricks used it to protect their system. He used it to destroy their system. He took the thing they turned him into, a source of useful energy, and figured out how to point that energy at the wall they hid behind. The pods inside the Citadel, which we see in Rick Mirai Jack in rows that stretch further than the eye can comfortably follow, were the infrastructure for this fuel production. Each pod held a Morty. Each Morty in a pod was being held in a state of sustained distress, their suffering being harvested as an ongoing energy source and fed into the device. The Mortys in those pods were not there because they had done something wrong. They were not there as a punishment or as a byproduct of some other process. They were there because their pain was the most efficient fuel source available for what Evil Morty was building. He needed a certain amount of energy to breach the curve, and he needed it continuously over whatever period of time the final construction and activation of the device required. And Morty's suffering was the mechanism that could generate it. The scale of suffering involved is not something the show asks you to look away from. The rows of pods are shown long enough and clearly enough that you understand you are looking at something enormous. This is not one facility. This is a conversion of the entire Citadel into a processing operation. The most technologically advanced society inside the central finite curve had been turned, under his presidency, into a machine for extracting energy from the pain of young boys. The Mortys who had voted for him because he promised something better for people like them ended up inside those pods. The Mortys who had been suffering at the bottom of the Citadel's class structure before he was elected continued suffering, just in a more direct and concentrated form, for a purpose that served only his escape. There is something worth examining in the specific choice to use Morty suffering, rather than some other energy source. A Rick as capable as the average Citadel Rick, given access to the Citadel's full resources, might theoretically have explored other approaches to the same problem. Whether any of those other approaches would have worked is something the show does not address, because Evil Morty is the one who solved the problem, not a Rick. But the choice of Morty's suffering as the specific fuel source is not presented as the only option he could think of. It is presented as the option he chose, and that choice is consistent with a specific understanding of the world that he had developed across his entire life. The world, as Evil Morty experienced it, ran on Morty's suffering. It had always run on Morty's suffering. The Citadel's class system was built on the labor and the limitation and the quiet daily pain of Mortys who had no real future. The Rick and Morty dynamic across its many forms was built on a young boy going through frightening and damaging experiences in service of a genius who needed him nearby for functional reasons. The central finite curve itself was built on the implicit suffering of every being inside it whose potential was permanently capped by a wall they did not know existed. Suffering had always been the fuel the system ran on. Evil Morty did not introduce that principle. He formalized it. He made it visible and deliberate and aimed in a specific direction. This does not make it acceptable, but it does make it coherent in a way that is important to understand. He did not do something alien to the world he came from. He took what the world had always done and applied it with full awareness and full intention toward his own ends. The Ricks of the Citadel harvested Morty value without acknowledging they were doing it. He harvested Morty's suffering while knowing exactly what he was doing. The difference is not comfort, exactly, but it is a difference. The construction phase of the plan, the years between winning the election and the moment in Rick Mirai Jack when the device is nearly ready, is not something the show depicts in detail. We do not see those years as they happened. We see the results of them when Rick and Morty arrive at the Citadel in the Season 5 finale and find a facility that is already deep into the final stages of preparation. The plan has been running long enough and smoothly enough that it is nearly complete before anyone from outside the Citadel has any idea what is happening inside it. This, again, is characteristic of how Evil Morty operates. Quietly. Without announcement, without the kind of visible disruption that would bring attention before he was ready for attention. He ran the Citadel as a sitting president while simultaneously converting it into the machine that would destroy it. And nobody from outside stopped him before he reached the point where stopping him was no longer possible. Rick C-137 and Morty C-137 arrive at the Citadel in Rick Mirai Jack. Not because they figured out the plan and came to stop it. They arrive because of a separate chain of events involving Rick's past and the story of his original Morty that the episode was already in the middle of exploring. Their arrival at the Citadel at that specific moment, when the device is almost ready, is not the result of heroic intelligence on their part. It is timing. And timing, in a story as precisely constructed as Evil Morty's, is something that can be accommodated rather than feared. He had thought about Rick C-137 specifically. He had built his understanding of what Rick was and what the curve meant partly through whatever personal history he had with this Rick. The arrival of Rick C-137 at the moment of near completion was not a surprise that broke the plan. It was the final scene of a story that Evil Morty had been telling since the first episode he appeared in, and it was a scene he was prepared for. The device was ready. The fuel had been collected. The Citadel, that had once been the symbol of Rick's dominance over the multiverse, was now the instrument of the most direct challenge to that dominance that had ever been attempted. And the person standing at the center of all of it was the Morty with the mechanical eye, who had walked into a crowd of confused children in Season 1 and disappeared so cleanly that a room full of geniuses could not find him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything that was built across all the years and all the sections of this story was about to happen in a single episode. And when it finally did, it was not the battle, or the confrontation, or even the destruction that mattered most. It was the moment right before all of that, when Evil Morty and Rick C-137 stood in the same room, and the full weight of everything between them was finally allowed to be in the open. Section 11. The Destruction of the Citadel and the Break, S5E10. There are endings that feel earned and endings that feel inevitable, and the best ones feel like both at the same time. The finale of Season 5, the episode called Rick Mirai Jack, is the kind of ending that lands with the full weight of everything that was built before it. Every section of this essay has been moving toward this episode. Every detail about the Citadel's class system, the central finite curve, the election, the pods, the plan, all of it was pointing here. To this room, to this confrontation. To the moment when a Morty with a mechanical eye and a lifetime of preparation finally stood across from the Rick who, whether he fully admits it or not, is the reason all of this happened in the first place. What takes place in Rick Mirai Jack is not a simple action sequence or a standard season finale where the heroes stop the villain and everything resets. It is something more final, and more honest than that. It is the conclusion of a story that the show had been telling in fragments since season 1, and when it arrives, it does not flinch. The episode begins with Rick C-137 and Morty C-137 in a situation that has nothing to do with the Citadel. What pulls the episode into the direction of the finale is the story of Rick's past, specifically the flashback sequences we discussed in Section 8 that reveal what Rick C-137's life looked like before he settled into the version of it we see throughout the show. These flashbacks are not a detour. They are the episode establishing the full emotional context before placing Rick in the room with the person his past most directly produced. By the time Rick and Morty arrive at the Citadel, the audience has just been given a version of Rick's history that makes the confrontation ahead land with maximum weight. When they arrive at the Citadel, what they find is not the society we have seen in previous episodes. The Citadel as a functioning community of Ricks and Mortys going about their lives is gone. What remains is a facility in the final stages of preparing something enormous. The conversion that evil Morty executed across his presidency is complete. The pods are everywhere. The device is almost ready. The Citadel of Ricks, the organization that Rick C-137 always refused to join, and that spent a significant portion of its history viewing him as a problem, has been turned into the machine that will attempt to do what no Rick ever tried to do from the inside. Break the wall they built around themselves. Evil Morty and Rick C-137 come face to face in this episode, and the conversation that happens between them is the emotional center of the entire season finale. It is not a long conversation. It is not a back-and-forth debate where both sides make their case and the audience is invited to score points. It is more one-sided than that, and the direction it goes in is not the one you might expect, given that Rick C-137 is theoretically the main character of the show. Evil Morty speaks, and what he says is not a villain monologue. It does not have the shape of someone who wants to be talked out of their plan, or who needs the audience to understand how smart they are. It has the shape of someone delivering a truth they have been carrying for a very long time to the person who most needs to hear it, without any particular expectation that it will change anything. He explains the central finite curve. He explains what it is, and what it means, and who built it, and why. He describes it as what it actually is: a wall around every universe where Rick is the smartest being alive. A structure designed not to protect the people inside it, but to guarantee that the person who built it would always be on top. He does not frame this as an accusation exactly. He frames it as a fact, as something that is simply true about the world Rick built, and the world that Rick benefits from, and the world that produced everything evil Morty has spent his life working to escape. The curve is Rick's ego made into a physical structure, and every living thing inside it, every Morty, and every Rick, and every other being in every dimension within that wall, lives inside a reality that was shaped around one man's need to always be the most important thing in the room. Rick C-137 does not argue with this. He does not tell evil Morty he is wrong. He does not defend the curve or explain it away or reframe it as something more benign than what evil Morty is describing. He listens. And in that listening, there is something that the show allows you to read as recognition. Not a confession in plain language. Rick C-137 is not built for that, and the show knows it. But the absence of a counter-argument from a man who is never short of counter-arguments is itself a kind of answer. What happens next is the part of the episode that makes clear the confrontation is not going to resolve in the way that confrontations in most shows resolve. There is no last-minute plan from Rick that neutralizes the threat. There is no clever reversal that puts him back in control of the situation. The device activates. Evil Morty set this in motion before Rick and Morty arrived, and their presence in the Citadel did not stop the process and was never going to stop it. The plan was too far along. The preparation was too complete. The only thing their arrival changed was that Rick got to be present for the moment when everything the Ricks built, the whole curated structure of the central finite curve and the Citadel at its center, started to come apart. The activation of the device is shown as something large and violent in its physical effects on the Citadel. The structure that has housed this society for as long as it has existed begins to fail. The Citadel, which survived the destruction of the Council of Ricks in Season 3, and which absorbed the political revolution of Evil Morty's election, and which continued functioning through years of being converted into something entirely different from what it was built to be, cannot survive this. The device it was converted to power is now using it up. The energy that was harvested from the pods, the concentrated suffering of enormous numbers of Mortys that was collected and stored and directed through the device's systems, is being released all at once toward the wall of the central finite curve. The Citadel is being consumed in the process. The Mortys in the pods are freed as the Citadel collapses around them. This is not a rescue in the deliberate sense. Evil Morty did not include the freeing of the pods as a step in his plan out of compassion for the Mortys inside them. The pods are released because the systems holding them are failing along with everything else. The Mortys, who were kept in states of sustained distress to fuel the device, are suddenly out and disoriented and in the middle of a collapsing structure. What happens to them in the chaos of the Citadel's destruction is not something the episode follows in detail. The show does not tie that thread into a neat resolution. The Mortys are there, and then the focus of the episode moves on, which is itself a kind of commentary. They were fuel. Even in the moment of their release, the story of the episode is not primarily about them. Rick and Morty are in the middle of all of this, trying to survive the destruction happening around them. The Citadel breaking apart is not a controlled or orderly process. It is collapsing and burning and tearing itself apart under the strain of the energy being directed through it and the structural failure that follows. Rick C137, who has survived an essentially uncountable number of dangerous situations across the run of the show, is in genuine danger here in a way that the episode communicates clearly. This is not an adventure with a comfortable outcome waiting at the end. This is the destruction of something enormous, and they are inside it. Evil Morty, meanwhile, is moving toward the breach. The device has done what it was built to do. The wall of the central finite curve, the physical boundary that separated the curated section of the multiverse from the true infinity beyond it, has been broken open. There is a portal. Not the green portals that Rick's portal gun produces, the familiar circular openings that connect one point inside the central finite curve to another. This one is different. It is golden. It is larger, and it hums with a quality that signals something fundamentally different from anything a portal gun could create. It is not a door to another place inside the curve. It is a door out of the curve entirely. A door into the infinite multiverse that exists beyond the wall, where Rick is not guaranteed to be the smartest being alive, where the rules are not designed around his dominance, where everything that the central finite curve was built to prevent is simply the normal condition of an open and uncurated reality. He walks through it. This is the moment that the entire story of Evil Morty has been building towards since the final seconds of Season 1, Episode 10. A Morty with a mechanical eye, who spent years in the shadows of a system designed to keep him there, who ran a multiverse-spanning plan across multiple seasons of a show with a patience and a precision that no other character in the story could match, walks through a golden portal into a part of the multiverse that nobody inside the curve had ever accessed. He does not look back. He does not make a final speech. He does not stand at the edge of the portal and give a monologue about what he has accomplished and what it means. He walks through. The door closes. He is gone. The simplicity of that exit is important. It is consistent with everything about how this character operates. He never announced himself when he did not need to. He never performed triumph for an audience. The eye patch coming off in Season 1 was not a moment of theatrical revelation. It was a practical step in his disappearance. The election victory was not celebrated with visible satisfaction. It was immediately followed by the removal of everyone who expected a relationship with him going forward. The exit through the golden portal is the same. No theater, no speech. Just the completion of the thing he set out to do, executed cleanly and without decoration, and then he is through, and the portal is gone. What is left behind is the wreckage of the Citadel. The society that the Ricks built, the one that Rick C137 always refused to join, and that Evil Morty was born into and suffered under, and eventually commandeered and converted into the machine of his escape, is gone. The physical structure is destroyed, The organizational body is destroyed. The Council of Ricks was already gone before this episode. Now the Citadel itself is gone. The institution that represented the collective power of the smartest beings in the managed multiverse no longer exists. What remains of the Citadel's population, the Ricks and Mortys who survived the destruction, is scattered in the wreckage of something that no longer has a shape or a future. Rick C-137 and Morty C-137 survive. How they get out of the collapsing Citadel is shown in the episode, though the focus is less on the mechanical specifics of their escape and more on what the experience means for Rick. He has just watched, from close range, the destruction of an institution he always claimed not to care about. He has just heard, from someone who may have been his original Morty, a clear and unarguable explanation of the most uncomfortable truth about himself. He has just seen the wall he benefited from his entire life broken open by someone who had every reason to want it gone. And he could not stop any of it. The genius, the most capable and adaptable and resourceful Rick in the multiverse by most accounts, was present for the end of the Citadel and was not able to change the outcome. That is not a comfortable position for Rick C-137 to be in. And the episode is honest about the weight of it. The golden portal that evil Morty walked through is gone. The breach it represented, the opening in the central finite curve, is also gone by the end of the episode. Whether the curve itself remains fully intact after what happened, whether the breach left a permanent change in the structure of the multiverse, or whether the Ricks who built it well enough that even this could not permanently damage it, is something the show leaves open. What is not open is where evil Morty went. He went through. He is on the other side of the wall now, in the part of the multiverse that was built by nobody, curated by nobody, and designed around nobody's ego. He is in a reality where Rick being the smartest being in the room is not a guaranteed condition of existence. He is free in the most complete and literal sense that the word can mean in the context of this story. The end of the Citadel and the break through the curve is not a happy ending in any traditional sense. Too much was destroyed. Too much was done to too many people in the process of getting here. The Mortys in the pods, the Ricks and Mortys who died in the Citadel's collapse, the voters who thought they were choosing something better for themselves and ended up as fuel, none of them got an outcome that looks like justice. What happened was enormous, and it was real, and it changed the shape of the multiverse in ways the show has not fully explored yet. But it was, at its core, one being's escape from a prison that was built without his consent and maintained without his agreement. And that escape succeeded completely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question of what all of this means, what Evil Morty's story says about the show, about Rick, about the nature of the relationship between them, and about what kind of figure Evil Morty actually is when you look at the full picture, is the question that the final section of this essay exists to answer. Section 12. What Evil Morty Means, Legacy, Themes, and the Unanswered Question. Stories do not end when the credits roll. They keep going in the mind of the person who experienced them, turning over slowly, revealing new angles the longer you sit with them. The story of Evil Morty is one of those. It does not close cleanly when he walks through the golden portal at the end of Season 5. It stays open in a way that is clearly intentional. A deliberate choice by a show that has always been more interested in honest complexity than in the kind of resolution that lets you put something down and stop thinking about it. Evil Morty is gone, somewhere beyond the wall he spent his entire life working to break through. And the questions his story leaves behind are not small ones. They are questions about power and freedom and what it means to fight a system, and about whether the person doing the fighting can be called a hero, and about what the show is actually saying about its own main character when it builds an arc this carefully and points it in this direction. These questions are worth taking seriously because the answers, or the honest acknowledgement that some of them do not have clean answers, are where the real weight of this story lives. Start with the most basic question. Is Evil Morty a villain? The instinct to say yes is understandable and not entirely wrong. He killed Ricks. He kidnapped and caused enormous suffering to enormous numbers of Mortys. He used the genuine pain and hope of an entire population of voters as fuel for a plan that had nothing to do with improving their lives. He removed people without hesitation the moment they stopped being useful to him. He ran the Citadel as a machine for harvesting suffering, and did so with full awareness of what he was doing. None of these things are defensible. None of them become acceptable because of the circumstances that produced him or the goal he was working toward. The harm he caused was real, and it was chosen, and it was sustained across years. By any straightforward measure of the word, he did villainous things. But the show does not present him as a simple villain. And the reason it does not is not sloppy writing or an unwillingness to condemn what he did. It is because the story around him is constructed in a way that refuses to let the word villain carry all the weight by itself. A villain, in the simple sense, is someone whose goals are wrong and whose methods are wrong and who exists in opposition to something good. Evil Morty's goals were not wrong. Freedom from a prison you were placed in without your consent. A prison built by someone else to serve their own interests is not a wrong goal. The wall he broke through was real. The unfairness of the world inside it was real. The specific damage done to him and to every Morty inside the central finite curve by the system that Ricks designed and maintained was real. He was right about all of that. His methods were brutal and indefensible. His goal was not. This combination, right about the problem, wrong about the method, is not a comfortable place to leave a character. It does not give you the clean feeling of having sorted the story into heroes and villains and understood who to root for. It gives you something harder to hold, which is the recognition that a person can be completely correct about the injustice they experienced and completely wrong about how they chose to respond to it. That correctness does not make the wrongness acceptable, and the wrongness does not cancel out the correctness. Both things are true at the same time, and the show asks you to hold both without letting one collapse into the other. The question of whether Evil Morty is the only character in the show who ever told Rick the truth is connected to this. Think about the confrontation in Rick Murray Jack. Evil Morty stands in front of Rick C137 and explains the central finite curve in terms that are clear and direct, and do not leave room for Rick to pretend he does not understand what is being said. He tells Rick, in plain language, that the managed section of the multiverse exists to make Rick feel like the most important thing in it. That the wall around it was built to keep out every reality where that was not true. That every adventure Rick ever went on, every dimension he ever visited, every being he ever met inside the curve, was part of a curated experience designed around his ego. He tells Rick that the relationship between Rick's and Morty's, the relationship that Rick C137 has dressed up in genuine love and chosen family and real moments of connection, has a structure underneath all of that which is about use. About a genius keeping a less intelligent person nearby because it makes the genius harder to track. About a system that takes young boys and assigns them a permanent supporting role in someone else's story. Rick C137 does not argue with any of this. He has argued with practically everyone about practically everything across 5 seasons of television. He is one of the most verbally combative characters in the history of the medium, and he stands there in silence while Evil Morty explains the ugliest truths about his world and does not push back. The silence is the answer. The show did not write that silence by accident. Rick knows. He has always known, in the way that very intelligent people know the things they have decided not to look at directly. Evil Morty looked at them directly, out loud, in front of him. And there was nothing to say because there was nothing wrong with what was being said. No other character in the show does this. Morty C137 pushes back against Rick sometimes, challenges him in specific moments, expresses hurt when Rick's behavior causes hurt. But he does not dismantle the entire architecture of their relationship and the world it exists in with the clinical precision that Evil Morty brings to that conversation. Beth and Jerry and Summer are all embedded in the same family structure, and none of them have the combination of distance and closeness that Evil Morty has. They are too inside the thing to see its whole shape from the outside. Evil Morty is the only character in the story who has both the personal experience of the Rick and Morty dynamic from the Morty's side and the intellectual framework to describe exactly what that dynamic is when you strip away the warmth and look at the bones of it. His position, the specific combination of things he went through and what those things turned him into, is what makes him capable of saying what he says in that room. And the show treats what he says as true, not as the distorted perspective of a villain rationalizing his actions, as true. This is the most significant thing the show does with Evil Morty as a character. It uses him to say something honest about Rick that the show could not say as effectively through any other character. Rick C-137 is the protagonist. He is funny, and he is brilliant, and he does love the people in his life, even when he fights that love constantly. The show has been honest throughout its run about his flaws, his selfishness, his emotional avoidance, the ways his genius coexists with a deep capacity for causing harm to the people around him. But the central finite curve is the largest and most fundamental version of that critique. It is not about Rick being sometimes selfish or sometimes careless. It is about Rick building, or being part of building, a version of reality that was engineered around his need to always be the most important being in it. Evil Morty is the character the show created to say that out loud clearly and completely, to hold the mirror up to its own main character and not look away from what the reflection shows. The legacy of Evil Morty on the show extends beyond what his arc says about Rick. It extends to what it says about the Rick and Morty dynamic as a whole. The show has always played both sides of that relationship. It has shown the genuine love and the genuine harm in the same episodes, sometimes in the same scenes. But Evil Morty's existence is the most extreme version of the question the show keeps asking underneath all its humor and its science fiction adventure. What does it actually do to a person to be the Morty in this arrangement? What does it cost? What does it produce in the person who goes through it? The answer the show gives through Evil Morty is the darkest possible version of that question's answer. It produces someone who learned to see the world entirely in terms of use and function, because that is how the world treated him. Someone who became incapable of genuine alliance or genuine connection, because the one relationship that should have been the most defining connection of his life taught him that connection was a performance people put on while using each other. Someone who turned the experience of being a tool into the skill of using tools, and applied that skill with a precision and a lack of sentiment that reflected exactly what he had been taught. The unanswered question that Section 12 was always going to have to sit with is the one about what happens next. Where is Evil Morty now? What does an existence beyond the central finite curve actually look like? The show has not answered this as of the end of Season 5, and the fact that it has not answered it is itself meaningful. His story does not have a resolution beyond the escape. He walked through the portal, and the portal closed, and that is where his arc ends, for now. The show leaves him out there in the true infinity, free in the most complete sense, and does not follow him there. Whether that is because the writers intend to bring him back and are leaving the thread open deliberately, or because the escape is the point and following him beyond it would undo what the escape means, is something only future seasons will clarify. Both possibilities are interesting. Both are consistent with how carefully this arc was constructed. What the escape means thematically, regardless of whether he returns, is something the show has already made clear enough through everything that leads up to it. The central finite curve coming down, even partially, even temporarily, even at the cost of everything it cost, represents the failure of the most fundamental argument the Ricks ever made. The argument that their intelligence entitled them to design the conditions of existence for everyone around them. The argument that the smartest being in the room had the right to decide what the room looked like and who was allowed in it, and what role each person inside it was assigned. Evil Morty did not defeat that argument by being smarter than Rick. He did not out-genius the genius. He did something the Ricks never anticipated because it never occurred to them to anticipate it. He took their system apart using their own materials. He used the Citadel against the curve. He used Morty biology against Rick's wall. He used the election process against the political structure that the election process was designed to maintain. He did not bring something from outside. He found the contradictions inside and followed them all the way to the end. The show never calls him a hero. It does not ask you to celebrate what he did or to feel good about the methods he used. But it also does not let you dismiss him as simply a villain whose defeat or escape resolved the problem he represented. The problem he represented, the deep and real unfairness of a reality engineered around one being's ego at the cost of everything and everyone else inside it, does not go away when he walks through the portal. It remains. Rick C-137 is still Rick C-137. The dynamic between Rick's and Morty's, wherever it continues across the multiverse and the dimensions that survived the Citadel's collapse, is still what it always was. The wall may or may not have been permanently damaged. The truth that evil Morty spoke in that room before he left is still true. What changes is that someone did something about it. Imperfectly. Brutally. In ways that caused enormous harm to people who deserved better. But something was done. The most powerful institution inside the most controlled section of the multiverse was dismantled by the last being anyone inside it would have thought to be afraid of. And the person who did it walked through a door that was never supposed to exist and went somewhere that the Ricks, for all their genius and all their preparation and all their careful engineering of reality, never figured out how to follow. That is the story of evil Morty, a system that thought it had accounted for everything, undone by the one variable it never took seriously enough to watch. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.